Now, in today's video, we're going to take you to a step-by-step process that we took to create one of these realistic, lifelike models for the movie industry by first making a mold of a hand, in this case, a life casting model, to create a model that's hard and durable that we can sculpt on top of in order to make a urethane rubber mold. In this mold, we finally casted our silicone with an embedded armature so that we can actually change the positioning of the model itself once it's made. So let's just jump into this project, see how it's done. Now, to start our project, I first need a model of my hand. And for that, I'm using the Ecoflex 0035, which is a skin-safe silicone and can be used for life casting. Now, why did I decide to go with a platinum silicone to make an original model over, let's say, alginate? It's just, it has more potential. I can cast as many models as I want into a single mold, and I'm going to retain that mold for future uses, and also going to capture all the detail from my hand. Make sure you rub that material into the finest crevices of your hand, of the model. That way we capture all the detail. Also note, I did shave my hand to prevent any of the hairs from being encapsulated and sticking into the silicone. Now, remember, this is a fast setting silicone, so 2.5 minutes work time and 5-minute cure. So the material has set up, and we can go ahead and start pulling my hand out of the mold box. And then we're going to sprinkle some baby powder into our mold. This will prevent any surface tensions from forming inside the mold as we're pouring our casting medium, therefore preventing any kind of surface imperfections and air bubbles. Now, for the casting, we're going to be using the Smoothcast 300 urethane casting resin. We're going to add also a little bit of the So Strong black. That will change our casting from a bright white to a nice soft gray. To minimize any chances of air bubbles collecting in our casting, I first fill up the mold about halfway, tilt it back and forth a little bit to dislodge any air bubbles that might be trapped before finally topping it off with the rest of the material. The material is now allowed 10 minutes cure before demolding. And once the material has cured, we can go ahead and demold our casting. For that, I do need to open my mold. I'm using a mold knife here. I'm going to simply cut one side of the mold open to retrieve our model. Make sure you don't cut a straight line. You want to always cut in a zigzag line. That will help with the alignment. So here we have our casting out of the mold. And now we can focus on sculpting the detail into it. Note the amount of detail that was captured from the original life casting that we can see even in the wrist area here. So I have a picture of the model that I'm working from, and I want to add some stitching to the hand. So here I'm just laying out briefly kind of what we're going to do to this. We're going to lay out some stitching seam lines, and the top gets cut off just like that. And we're going to start by adding some alien clay. This is a wax-based clay that's reusable, remeltable, which is great because we can melt it and then start applying it to our model. Why we're doing that? We're going to use this clay base to sculpt into. And because this is a fast cooling material, within no time we're able to start the sculpting process into the clay. And using a variety of different sculpting tools, I'm going to follow the example of the original from the movie to sculpt some detail into our model. And here again, I'm using some molten clay to apply to the model where we're going to add the detail. Simply going to apply the clay and then flatten it out using a sculpting tool. In this case, it's an old spoon that I flattened out and carved to the shape that I like. Now, once we apply the clay, we can sculpt the fine detail into it, and then we're going to add some texture into that clay too by making small stamps using Equinox 38 medium platinum silicone rubber putty. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix this thoroughly by kneading it over itself, and then we're going to make a couple of small balls which we're going to flatten out for stamping. So here we have another one of my hands. I have several of these models that I made. And we're going to use that hand to basically pull off any of the detail, any of the skin detail that's in the original. We're going to pull from this model so that we can stamp the clay that we applied to the piece that we're actually working on. Make sure you press it firmly into the model to capture the detail. We're going to allow this now to set before moving on to the next step. All right, it's been 30 minutes and the Equinox 38 medium has a set where we can start to demold the pieces, and you can see they're come off quite easily. I can simply peel them off. We're going to simply soften up that clay and then use some of those stamps that we created to add realistic skin texture to the clay. This will translate into our final mold and therefore into the casting itself, making it look a lot more realistic than if we just left the clay the way it was sculpted. So here's a little close-up. You can see all that fine detail that we were able to press into that clay. Because the way the project or the model is laid out, I'm first going to have to make a mold of the top of the hand or the cap and then mold the rest of it. This will allow me to then maneuver and position aluminum rods that will hold our armature in place. So we're going to have to remove the cap from the model as well. And for that, I'm making myself a custom base that's going to go around. This is going to help us detain all the molding material. So here we're going to lay up some Sculptix Soft. This is to create a barrier between the model and the mold box. And go easy when applying this material because we already have a sculpted surface we don't want to disturb. So go very slowly and go very easy when applying a clay like this. And now a retaining field. This is going to be our mold box, so to say. A little bit of hot melt glue to make sure that it stays in place and we don't have any leaks once we pour the molding compound over the model. One more bead on the outside. Again, it's really important for me not to have any leaks. It will be very difficult to stop a leak on this kind of setup. Now we're going to apply a release agent to the working surface. This is East Release 200, and we're going to apply it in a spray brush spray technique. The release agent is now allowed 5 minutes drying before applying any molding material to the model. For the mold itself, we're going to be using a product called Compat 45. This is a non-inhibiting urethane rubber, which means it will not inhibit the cure of most platinum silicones out there. Great for casting of silicone, where you don't want to use a release agent in your mold. Makes it great for castings that you're going to paint. As always, scrape the sides, scrape the bottom, and as I do here, double mix the material. It's the cheapest insurance policy you have for mixing the product correctly. The Compat 45 is now poured in the lowest part of the mold and allowed to rise and level itself on its own. That way, it's going to push any air bubbles away from our model and not trap them on the model and mold surface. A quick check over the entire mold box. Make sure there's no leaks. You don't want to pour material like this and then walk away. You always want to double check, make sure there's no leaks. The material is now allowed a cure of 16 hours before demolding. It's now been 16 hours and our Compact 45 mold has cured. We can simply peel away the mold box to relieve our model inside. It's been stuck in there. So here we're going to take everything off and remove that clay, Sculpting clay that we build up around our model. Once we remove that, we can then remove the actual mold from the model itself. Once most of the residue of the Sculpting oil-based clay has been removed, by hand, we can follow up by cleaning the mold using isopropyl alcohol. This will remove last residue of the oil-based clay out of the mold, including the release agent that was applied to the model before making the mold. We already took care of molding the top of the hand here, the cutoff part. Now we can focus on rest of the hand. Here you can see I'm going over various sculpting tools to obtain the detail of the hand itself that is in the model. You can see here again that I'm using the hot air gun to soften up some of the clay itself and then add texture by using those texture stamps that we created off the original model. To start the mold making process of the entire hand, the rest of our model here, we're first going to roll out a clay bed. This is Sculpting Soft. And then I'm going to trace the outline of the hand, which is our model, in that clay. Why? We're going to submerge that hand halfway, and we need a base to work off of. So we have rolled out clay, and because the surface underneath is hard and I don't want to disturb any of the details that we sculpted into the model, I put down a little bit of packing foam in the bottom of our clay buildup here. That way it's not sitting against a hard surface directly. Now we can lay our model into the clay, and this is not quite halfway laid into the clay, so we still need to add more clay around the perimeter. Also note there's two wires sticking out of the back of the hand. Those are very crucial. That's the wire that's going to be part of the armature of our future silicone casting, so they have to be in the mold build itself. That's where the wire is going to be held in place to be then encapsulated by silicone later on. Once the clay itself has a nice clean line all the way around our model, we can proceed by adding some keys. Now I'm not only adding keys into the clay itself by pressing into the clay, notice also the keys all around. There's positive keys sticking out, and then there's negative keys sticking into the clay. Now you might say at this point, wow, that's quite a bit of material extra all around the model. But one thing as a mold maker that I can tell you, the more material you have around your model and the more keys you can put in it, the more precise your castings are going to come out of that mold. That extra material around your model allows everything to fit together nicely and minimize any sort of chance for leakage around the edges of your model. The entire clay buildup is now encased in a mold box. Now an application of Ease Release 200 is applied in a spray brush spray technique. And once again, the release agent is allowed 5 minutes drying before applying any molding material to the model. And just like we did for the previous part of the mold, we're going to mix up some Compact 45. Again, this is a non-inhibiting urethane rubber. Now the material is poured into the mold box at the lowest point, and we're going to allow the material to seek its own level. So we're not going to pour all over the model, simply pour in one corner and allow the material to rise above your model. This will push any of the air bubbles away from the model itself. Now the material is allowed 16 hours to cure before being removed, and then move on to the second half of the mold. It's now been 16 hours. The first half of our mold has cured to a point where we can remove the back and remove all the clay buildup that we did for the first half. You can see here how those negative keys have now turned to positive keys and the positives to negative. Everything's upside down. One thing to keep in mind here, we're still keeping the pour spout and the air vent in the mold buildup. Those are going to retain in the first half of the mold, so when we pour the second half, we already have a pour and vent channels. Once again, Ease Release 200 is applied in the spray brush spray technique and is allowed a 5 minutes drying time before applying any of the molding product. We can now proceed on to mixing of the Compact 45 for the second half of our mold. And then once you mix the product, we can pour it into the mold box, again at the lowest point. And you can see here from the front view how that mold fills up with material. A quick look around the entire mold box to ensure there's no leaks, because we don't want a nasty surprise when we come back to our mold box. It's been now 16 hours and we're ready to demold our original. And you can see here the mold comes apart quite easily. And even though this is a 45 durometer rubber, we're easily able to remove the casting out of the mold by simply giving it a little bit of flex over the edge of the table. And the mold is now cleaned to remove any residue of the oil-based clays that were used in the molding process, as well as the release agent, the Ease Release 200, that was used in the molding process. And we're now on to the creation of the armature. So we do need to create an armature that's going to go into this mold. And for that, I'm using some aluminum wire that I simply measure and cut to lengths. And then I'm going to combine it all with a little bit more of the aluminum wire in the center where the wrist is, where we can actually hide a lot of that mechanical. Now, here's a pro tip when embedding armatures into silicone. You always want to make sure that you round off the tip where you cut the armature so that if it's direct contact with the silicone, it does not puncture through the silicone. I'm simply going to use a little bit of sandpaper to round those sharp edges of the aluminum wire. So this is really important. You can see here how that armature is going to be held in the mold, in place perfectly, so that every time we cast into the mold, we get a good casting where the armature is not showing on any one of the sides. Now the mold is closed and we're going to use a couple of boards. These are pressure boards. They're going to distribute the pressure that we're putting on the mold equally. They're going to distribute the pressure evenly throughout the block mold here and prevent any kind of leaking. Now for the casting process, we're using the Dragon Skin 10 NV. This is a low viscosity material, does not require vacuuming, but what I want you to see here is the fact how I'm coloring the material. So we're going to color the part A of the silicone by adding small quantities of silk pig to it, usually using a toothpick until we achieve the right desire of the color that we want. Make sure that you work thoroughly, double mix the product so that we don't end up with uncured material in our casting. And once the material is mixed, we can pour it into the mold. There's no vacuum degassing necessary because it is a no vacuum material, low viscosity. And then we're going to simply pour into the mold until it's full, until the mold itself is full. Now, even though it doesn't seem here, that mold has filled fully. Even though it didn't go over the top of the pour spout, I just did not want to waste any of the material. Now it's been 75 minutes and we can demold our casting. So here's the top of the hand. That came out quite nice. I'm happy that that cured fully and it retained all the detail from our original. And we can now open up our mold itself. So you can see here how far I poured into the mold, and it has captured all the detail from the original. Now, because the silicone is still a little bit see-through, we can see some of the wires inside, but once painted, those are going to disappear. We're going to cut away some of the flashing, that's the pour spout and the air vent, and then we're going to trim that aluminum armature that we put in. Simply trim that away. You can see how the fingers are movable, yet stay in place once moved. That's the armature at work on the inside. Now, to finalize our project here, we first need to cap the casting. So we prepped the second half of the casting, the cap, and we're going to adhere it using some Silpoxy. This is a one-component silicone adhesive. There's no mixing. It's just apply and stick. And to make sure that it sticks in the right places, we're going to use some sewing pins to hold that down, to make sure that it cures and stays in the position that you want it to be. Now, the Silpoxy has a working time of 5 minutes and a cure time of 1 hour. Here, a little bit of extra of the silicone adhesive is squeezed in to the crevices, and additional pins are then applied. The Silpoxy is now allowed to cure for 1 hour before proceeding on to the next step. Now that the adhesive has cured, we can proceed by removing the pins that were holding everything in place. And then we're going to start the painting process. We're going to start by cleaning the entire surface using some naphtha, or in this case, we're using the Coleman fire fuel. It's also going to be the thinning agent for our painting process. Here I'm actually scraping off some of the seam lines, some of the flashing, using a razor knife, which goes really easily. Now, the Psycho-Paint is a silicone paint medium. It's a clear, translucent medium. And what we do is we add some pigments into the Psycho-Paint to obtain the color that you want to paint on. If you just use silicone pigments, they're never going to cure. So you need a carrier that's going to cure with the pigment in it. And here I am applying, using a brush, several different layers of skin tone pigments to obtain a color that I desire. So we started with a base color of the silicone, so it's not translucent fully. And now we're adding basically layer after layer of thinned out Psycho-Paint with colorant in it to obtain the final color of the casting. You can definitely thin out the Psycho-Paint to a airbrush level. I personally like to apply a few layers by brush, and here even with a mixing stick, to get into those grooves so they will register a darker pigment that makes the skin texture even more pronounced. And then once I'm satisfied with the application and I'm ready to add some darker tones and some more color, I'm actually going to switch over to using the airbrush. So again, going around the entire model, you can see how much time this actually takes to paint a silicone piece. So it's quite a difficult and lengthy process. It definitely takes a learning curve to grasp it. So the addition of the solvent, in this case the Coleman fire fuel, to the Psycho-Paint will prolong not only the working time of the material, but also the cure time. So the cure time of 2 hours is out of the window. I personally allow this a cure time of 6 hours before proceeding on to add additional layers. A little bit more of the Psycho-Paint with a darkened color. I think I even used a brown and black here just to give some of the deeper detail in the skin, in the sculpt, in this case where the stitching comes together. One thing that I'm going to tell you, and you're going to see it in one of the pictures, is the fact that I Always have 1 or 2 spare castings, either casting issues that I had with a casting itself that I test my theory, my colorants on. And here in the right corner, you can actually see one of those castings that I keep just to test my color theory, what I'm applying, making sure that the pigment that I'm applying to my final casting is the right tone that I'm aiming for. And then using an airbrush, I'm going to apply several different layers of different tones of colorant to get the desired color of the finished casting. Start with the lightest color and work your way up to the dark. And here's a semi-finished piece. All I have to do now is add the stitching, color to the stitching. And for that, I mixed up some Psycho paint again with black, Silk Pig black, to simply paint over these stitches. Now for a final layer, I like to actually paint everything with a clear coat that has a little bit of the Novox matte in it. That will turn down the glossiness of the silicone. But that doesn't mean we don't need the glossiness. Here we're adding a little bit of the Psycho paint just by itself to the fingernails. And that's going to bring some of the fingernail gloss back to our casting. So be very strategic on how you apply the materials. Understand that silicones do have gloss to them. So if you want to retain some of the matte finish, you should be using something called Novox matte as your final layer to smooth out some of that glossiness. Finally, a final touch on the sculpt here is to add realistic stitching to the cap, to the top of the hand. And for that, I'm using an old leather stitching needle and some rope and thread to finalize our casting. And here is the final result of our work. So everything came together nicely between the molding of the original hand, sculpting the detail into the model, the fixing of the hand, embedding of the armature, and then finally painting it. All came together to show us a very good project that I'm very satisfied with how it turned out. Now, if you got inspired by this project and you'd like to give your own projects a go and need some material, you can visit any one of our distributors around the world. So, and there you have it, a step-by-step procedure that we took here to create an ultra-realistic life casting using silicone for the movie industry, or for any occasion for that matter. Now, if you have an idea about what we should do next, please let us know down in the comments below. And if you liked the video, hit the thumb up button. Now, to keep up with our latest mold making, casting, and other videos, remember to subscribe.